order for the work session, and today it's district priorities and an intro to the multi-tiered system of supports. Dr. Sanford.
Yes, we thought it would be a good idea to go through some of the things that are part of our district priorities that you may be a little less familiar about, but yet you'll hear different things as we move through the year for implementation. So MTSS, multi-tiered system of supports, isn't necessarily new, but full implementation is what we're really working toward in our district. We have a lot of the pieces already in place, but we still have some level of variability with some of the components of MTSS. And so over the next course of 2 to 3 years, what we're trying to do is really get things consistent, get great clarity about how we do interventions for students, both for academic interventions as well as behavioral interventions. The SAT process factors into that student assistance team, and the ways that we decide what a student might need to be successful. And so then with that, it's the actual training that we may need to do as a district for the skills that our teachers and our staff members have to do things well with academic interventions, instructional interventions, as well as when we're supporting students that might have behavioral needs or a need related to disability. It's always that tooling and retooling of our actual instructional skills and strategies. So with that, we have Dr. Boyson, who's going to give part of the overview. Sorry, if you're way over there. And then Dr. Fedden, I believe, is part of.
We have our whole MTSS team.
The whole MTSS team is here.
Yes,
That's
Dr.
good.
Knoll.
Are you all speaking?
We are.
Wonderful.
Mitch Schaefer, Sarah Clausen, Dr. Fedden, and Patty Lake Torbert. So our whole team will.
Well, then I think it's a good idea to turn it over to you.
All right. So our whole team's here today to talk about the MTSS process and that tiered system of supports in the Sioux Falls School District. And we started that process with our admin last spring when we introduced this idea of the multi-tiered system of supports, and we did a perceptual survey. And so we took that information as this team formed together starting in July, and we took that to help build, we had to assess to know where we were at and set the direction for the year. And so that multi-tiered system of support really sets that framework to leverage our staff, our students in that progress as we move through. We look at our goals and our outcomes and how do we help support those students. And so when we look at that system of support, when you think about everything that we're doing when we set the district priorities, we are leveraging that information, and the multi-tiered system of support fills right in with academic success, with all the academics, with the well-being, that social emotional, community engagement, how are we supporting our community, staff excellence, and then how do we use those resources across the district equally so all students have access to all resources. And so our learning objectives for today are really to take and bridge the MTSS gap. So how do we take research and put it into practice, looking at evidence-based research practices to make sure that we're using the best of the best so we are the best district in the nation. And we need to develop a common understanding of what MTSS is in the Sioux Falls School District. Is it something new, or do we have these practices and processes already here? And how do we leverage that information to make sure we're not duplicating, but we fill in the gaps where we have gaps also? So is that in academics? Is it in behavior? Is it in that social and emotional? Because all of those are part of MTSS. And then we want to connect that with the work that we already have in the district, because we have all these great things there, but how do we streamline it and bring it together? Again, so what I have access for in my building, you have access for that also. And that we're all following that same process. And then we're going to go through the information that was we received from our building administration when we did that perceptual survey back in June with them to guide our work. And then when we were working with our staff, with our admin, we had them write down some action that you have done lately to support a student, a family, a colleague, and a staff member. So then that just supports the MTSS work. I'll turn it over to Dr. Knoll.
a lot of the information that you'll see here today is very similar to what we went through with our administrators, and trying to talk through that process and to calm some of the fears of what is this new item or new thing that you're bringing in, and really it was not new. It's much more so trying to make it systemic of what we're already doing, and how do we put all those pieces together to try to make it one system of support for our students. And so part of it that we talked about in there is the research to practice gap that exists in there. There's a lot of things that we know and realize, especially in the area of research. If you think with John Hattie and information that comes from there, how do we get that into implementation and practices that we utilize within our classrooms? One of the examples that I'd utilized with this is the Freshman Academy that you'll be familiar with, that occurred at Washington High School about 13 years ago. It took a couple years in there where we looked at, especially the first year, looking at the research of what that looked like, some of that information that we would take and garner, and then how did we get that all the way from there into practice that we would utilize within our actual building and the setting with our freshman students. And so many things that we talked about this with the admin is what are new initiatives that you've started? If you think back, how did you begin that, and what was the process of implementation? And it's much the same with the MTSS process, that we're trying to take it over a period of time to look at what does the research say and how are we going to put that into practice, and what things do we need to build in between there to be able to create that, fill in that gap. Part of the implementation science to this, and each one of our schools will be at a different place. The exploration area where we're looking at trying to figure out what are some of the things that we have, what are some of the assets that we're going to need, intervention components that are needed. So some will begin all the way at that exploration, because there's some of those things that they just do not have the supports for, and we need to look at to find out what those gaps are and to fill that in. Then you go into installation, where we're looking at how do we install some of those things within our schools, to initial implementation and then full implementation. If you see the arrows going back and forth, some of these things we're going to realize. Some schools will have more that's already been in place. Some will have fewer. Some will have some different assessments that they'll utilize or different programs that they've implemented. How do we create that across the whole district, so we look at some of those best practices that have been utilized throughout our whole district and be able to say, how will this fit for our whole system of schools? And so as we go through this process with each of the schools together, and so far we've been meeting as entire groups with all the admin K-12. We sometimes split them in half, but it's still a mixture of the kindergarten through high school admin that are there. And we look at it, and we could go back and forth. At some point in time, we're going to see that we're doing quite well. We're starting to implement, and then we realize there's some other gaps that we're going to need to fill in. What assessments do we need for that? What programming do we need for that? If it's staffing that may be needed for that. And so it may cause us to go back and look at some additional installations that we will have. And this is a process that they're going to have. The probably most important thing that we tried to point out is we're so eager to do it right now and be done. And there's some that are probably at that point where they say, all right, we're ready. We've got many of these things in place. Let's just put it in this year and we'll start going with it. It's really something we need to do throughout the entire district. So we have many of the forms, many of the assessments. When we are referring a student to some type of a placement, does that look very similar to one elementary school or one middle school to the next, so that those students are equitably treated? So we're trying to look at this over a 2 to 4 year time period, probably much more so towards that 2-year end of it, but it's not something that'll be implemented in 1 year. So a part that we left with the admin on it is this statement: implementation is not an event, but a process involving multiple decisions and actions. Although implementation can take longer than we hope or anticipate, its process and trajectory can be predicted and shaped using staged approach. And that's what our hope is throughout this whole process. We've been leading the admin through this and saying these are the steps we're trying to complete this year. This is what we're going to look at for the next year, year number 2, as part of the implementation of that. And this is what we need to assess as we go along the way. And so that's where we're building in throughout this first year.
Very much. So I'm going to share just a little bit about the common definition of MTSS. As we were working with staff, that becomes very important as we think about all the different initiatives that our staff have been through. We didn't want them to think that this is just one more thing that's coming down the pike and we're going to talk about this and then it's going to go by the wayside. So in order to achieve that, we had to come to this common understanding. So multi-tiered system of supports, to get us all on the same page, this is the definition that we focused on. So it's a framework, and it's focused not only on academics, but also on social, emotional, and behavioral well-being. And the focus of MTSS is on equity, inclusivity, and access for all students, but we know that that also takes that shared ownership. So we want all of our staff to be on board and to be taking that shared ownership and collaboration. And that includes across students, teachers, staff, administrators, family, community, policymakers, all of it's so intertwined. So again, we really wanted to make sure that we had that shared definition. And we paused and invited our administrators to ask their staff what stood out in this definition. And a lot really focused on that inclusivity, access for all students. So we want to really break down some of those divisions and silos that you're going to see here in a minute. So MTSS, as I've said, and as we really try to articulate, it's a framework. So it's not a thing. We don't MTSS kids in our district. So we really wanted to give that vision that MTSS is this umbrella, and underneath that we have all of our quality instructional practices. We have universal design for learning. We have different instructional strategies to help all kids access those learning opportunities. We're focused on social, emotional, behavioral, and on academics. So in some of the literature, and even in some school districts, they split out, they talk about MTSS-A, MTSS-B. We're being very careful to not do that because you can't peel those layers away from students. It's all intertwined. So we're really focusing on this vision. And at the core is that universal design for learning framework, but it's strong core instruction. And that's something our district has just been relentless in focusing on, from early childhood all the way through graduation and post-graduation.
Dr. Fedden, can you talk just a little bit more about universal design for learning, or you might hear that referred to as UDL? Can you just tell a little bit more about what that means?
Absolutely. So UDL is a broad concept that could include not only your physical structure and layout of your classroom environment to allow access for all students, but it's using different strategies, scaffolding. There's lots of different tools that teams can use to make sure that all kids are able to access learning opportunities. So it's an important concept in the work that we do.
So that means if you have a special education student in your classroom or a student who requires accommodations for language, that as you design those lessons, that allows, it's good for all kids. It's instructional strategies that help all students to learn, including those students who may also have some other accommodations.
So we use this analogy as well, the umbrella analogy, but then also we know that probably as staff were listening to this, they're again thinking, great, here we go again. One more thing that you're going to add to my plate. So what we really wanted to stress to them is that MTSS is the plate. Everything that they're already doing, all of these great instructional practices, professional learning, the way that we allocate funds to support the students and the staff, all of that falls within this and this concept of MTSS. And in just a minute, you're going to hear from Mitch and Patty and Sarah, and they will go through those building blocks or the essential elements of MTSS. And it's, as we've been working through this, it's really been very cool to see how everybody is seeing these pieces fall together. We can't just focus on curriculum and instruction, for example. We can't just focus on those good instructional practices to include all children. We have to make sure that we have all of the essential elements in place. So you will see that as we move forward talking about the framework. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
As Dr. Fedden mentioned, there are 6 essential elements, so we're going to take some time to go through each of those elements, and then also the surveys that we had relating to each element. So the first one is shared leadership, and as was implied earlier, MTSS is trying to get every one of these students with a label, or we might call them silos in education, equal access. And part of that is shared leadership. So making sure that someone who represents or is well-versed in each of these groups is part of the leadership team, giving guidance to instruction and behavior, all of those things. This comes in with teaming structures. We have teaming at the district level, the building level, and the grade level teams, and these arrows also go back and forth because information is not just shared one way, it's shared both directions. And here is the results of that perceptual survey relating to shared leadership. Of course, we always know that we have strengths and areas of growth, so I'll just focus on the areas of growth that were identified throughout this process. Consistency is one thing that was mentioned, integrating early childhood, having a common language, and then using data and problem solving to break down these silos between the different groups.
So communication, collaboration, and partnerships is the next essential element here with MTSS. And we know that the collaboration between families, schools, and communities is really important to improve our students and our schools and our district outcomes overall. Within the MTSS framework, our schools leadership teams will work together internally, but also need to also communicate with our groups outside of the schools to seek input and that feedback regularly to make those good informed decisions. Once we have that, those teams then are able to get that information out to our community members and let them know how we are doing. So as Dr. Boysen said, we have a lot of things that are already in place, as you see up here. One thing that, or a couple of things that came up are where we have to grow. Comes with being very deliberate with our communication with our families, engaging our families more. We know that we have a lot of EL families in our district. How do we systematically and deliberately involve them in our decision making? Sometimes there's some groups that get left out of our processes. So what does that look like within our schools that have high populations of our different families we have?
The next element is evidence-based practices, and this means making sure that both the instructional and the intervention that we are using is based in research and data. And do we have research to know that it's been effective elsewhere, and how are we gathering data to know that it's being used effectively here too? We don't have time to waste on things that we know aren't effective, so we have to know what is effective and are we using it with fidelity to make sure that it is being used the way it should be. So in the survey, areas for growth was cultural responsiveness. Are there groups that we are maybe not holding to high enough expectations that we should be holding to higher expectations? Fidelity, as I had mentioned. Enrichment, making sure that we're challenging all learners. And then making sure that we have a consistent process to determine what students need during this intervention and enrichment time, that we are utilizing that time the same across the district.
So building the capacity and infrastructure for implementation is the next essential element. We'll go through all 6 of them here, but we know that building the capacity to implement a multi-tiered system of support is really critical to being able to implement and then sustain that problem-solving and database decision-making process that we have. And that problem-solving, decision-making really are 2 critical pieces of this overall framework that we have, and we're really focusing on that, I know, within our special services leadership team and within our schools to come together and use what we have in place to make the best decisions for our students. So we know that professional learning is also another part of this process. As we've seen where we have taken our buildings through this particular presentation, there is still a lot of PD to take place out there within our schools, and so we're looking forward to what that looks like within our schools. We have things that are already in place as we see. We know we've gone through some different changes with our elementary schedules, having that student-centered schedule in place. We have the district is emphasizing our adult SEL, really looking at which ways we can help our adults through this process. There are things that we, of course, know that we have to grow with here, and that looks like our data-based decision-making within our schools. How do we make it more consistent within our buildings? We have SAT processes in place, but trying to pull those together to make them a little more consistent throughout our district.
Layered continuum of support is the next essential element of MTSS. And we're really looking at some of those interventions as well as enrichment, but the middle, the biggest piece of this is strong core instruction for all students. As Dr. Fedden mentioned, the UDL and making sure that all students have access within the classroom to the curriculum and instruction. One of the pitfalls of MTSS is sometimes we want to go directly to looking at the interventions, and that is not the process we're following. We're looking at how we can get all students involved in the core first, that strong core instruction, before we look at interventions and enrichment. The other thing to point out is intensified enrichment doesn't mean pulling students out. So it should be during a time that isn't during core instruction. Focusing on that as well. Oh yeah, the survey. Some areas of growth that came up in this area in the perceptual survey was consistency, as I had said before, making sure all buildings are looking at interventions and enrichment using the same data and all students have access at every place for both academic and social emotional behavior.
All right, and then our final essential element is database problem solving. So it's last, but it certainly is important. In our district, when database problem solving is implemented, teams use that consistent problem solving process to analyze and evaluate our information. We use this in the practice of providing high quality instruction and intentionally matching it to student needs and using it over time to make important educational decisions. Data is used effectively to improve learning and informs the patterns in our district. The students' performances, such as using them with the different groups, such as with special education or cultural groups. We utilize in the district, I'm gonna have you back up one time, please. Nope. In the district, we use the plan, do, study, and act format, and you're gonna see that we're gonna continue to use that with the MTSS model for problem solving. So, what do we already have in place? Early childhood teams have access to multiple sources of data. Some buildings are using Review 360 and SWIFT to analyze need for additional interventions. Student work is regularly analyzed in some team meetings, and there's a consistent plan for monitoring attendance. But what are our areas of growth? Well, we have a few of them. The first is building a capacity for all staff to regularly use data so that they can understand the needs of students and to help adjust instruction and what they need within their own building for their students. Also deepening the understanding of how to use data to identify the students that need interventions and enrichment, and to review the strength of programs such as the student assistant team and how we can improve that process going forward.
So this slide, we didn't have you do this activity, but we referenced that we invited everybody to start off by finding an activity that they had done recently to support a student, family, or a colleague. And we had each of the 6 essential elements spread out around the room. And then we had everyone go and put their Post-it notes up under which essential element aligned with that particular action. All of the 6 essential elements were filled with Post-its. And we did a gallery walk then and invited our administrators to look around the room. So what they could see is that they're already on that continuum and already engaging in the work. So this is just a great opportunity for us to streamline and to, bridge what's already happening in the schools. So. All right, and so really when we look at the multi-tiered system of supports, it takes the district strategic plan, our district priorities, it takes a school improvement plan, accreditation from the state, and it wraps it all together. And how do we look at everything that we are doing in the district to support that? Again, our school improvement plan, our results-driven accountability, our state accountability, and that's all part of the MTSS process. So it goes from the district level down to the building level, and then it goes down into the grade level and to the students for their own goal setting and accountability. And that's where that team comes in, and that's that whole MTSS process that flows through that system. And again, it goes back to that plan, do, study, act model. So we make a plan, we make sure that we review the data, we identify the need, we go to the researched evidence-based practices, we put it into practice, we study the results, and we act on it. If it didn't work, what are we gonna do next? And so again, it's that problem-solving process, that plan, do, study, act. And so as we go down the road with MTSS and the Sioux Falls School District, we talked to the building administrators about this whole process in August. We presented this information. Their assignment then was to go back and talk to their buildings and to inform, just give them the information on MTSS. And we had the next workshop with our building administrators just last week. And now we're starting to look at what are all the assessments out there in the district. What's your screeners, what's diagnostic, what's formative, what's summative. And so they're going back to their buildings and they're sitting with teams because we know the district assessments, but what are the assessments that maybe as a building level I put into practice or a classroom teacher put into practice? Where do we have overload? Where do we have gaps? And so they'll bring that information back to us in November. And then also along with that, they're bringing all their teams that they have in their building. So I have my sunshine team, I have my leadership team, I have my school improvement team, I have my whatever team. They're going to bring them all back together, and then we're going to go through that with them to look at where do we have overlaps. Are we doing all the same work on all of these teams, or can we combine those and reduce that? So again, what can we take off the plate? We're not putting more on the plate, but have we ourselves put multiple things on the plate? And then we're going to go in and, like the team has talked about, we're going to look at the forms that we use across the district. Do we have SAP forms that are consistent across the buildings, across the levels? 504 process. Where do we keep all this information? And then data analysis. Do we have that quickly at the fingertips of our building administrators and our teams? And so that's the process that we're going to go through. And again, like I believe Dr. Nold referenced, our building administrators, when we started talking about this in August, well, where's my checklist? I mean, they didn't say that exactly, but it is, tell me what I need to do because I want to make sure I'm doing what I need to do and we can get it done. Because that's the mentality, and that's what we do, is we want to get it done, but it is a 2 to 4 year process. And so we have it outlined for the rest of this year, bringing teams together in June, building teams together to really dig deep into that work to set the stage for next year. So that's the MTSS process, really looking at our curriculum, looking at our behavior supports, looking at how EL and special education and how everybody fits into that picture. So it doesn't matter which building I'm at, I have access to all the information. Stand by for any questions. The whole team.
So much of what we do, particularly the larger we get, we added 2 schools this year, and we look at what works and what doesn't when we get our big picture data back. In one of my past lives, when we began looking at assessments, if you asked an average elementary principal, how many assessments do we use to determine if students are reading at grade level? I got answers like, well, 4 and then 5, and I said, keep going, because when we really looked at what different things had been picked up here and there were actually 24, which meant that we couldn't say with certainty how we knew what was working and what wasn't. And so that's one of the most important steps that our buildings are going to help us with now over the next few months, is what really are we looking at to determine how we know kids are learning and what really gives us the best information, and then how do we get rid of some of the things that maybe aren't helping us with that. And then, like Teresa said, where are there gaps? But a lot of this is about consistency. If we make a decision that a child needs a different placement, we have to be really sure that we've done our due diligence in providing all of the supports we can, because that's a really big instructional and programmatic decision. How do we make sure that one building and another building are doing that with relative consistency so that we're making really good, solid decisions for children and families? So that's really what the big umbrella of this is about, is helping us streamline and be efficient and effective, but to make good decisions. make good decisions with our money for training and materials and staffing. And so if you can kind of think about it through that lens, it's that framework that allows us to do that. And then as we hook things on, we know intentionally why. It's to fill a gap, or it's to provide a better version of something, or it's a need that we're filling a gap that maybe we don't have in place. Questions from anyone?
I just think, thank you for doing all this, because I just think, as you've stated, we are a large district, and we do keep putting things on the plate, and if we're not reevaluating what we already is on the plate, we don't know what is working and what is not. I remember maybe 2 years ago, I think I emailed Dr. Boyson asking about all of the various testing and overlooks, and on our district website we have what is required district-wide, but not knowing what's in individual buildings on top of is something that needs to be looked at, so that we are making sure what we are using is effective, and that if we can eliminate anything, or if we need it all, we can now at least show and justify what is needed in our district, so that our staff and our families know why we're doing what we're doing.
I was just thinking about it from two perspectives. The first one would be when you hire new teachers, and imagine coming and you have this team of people that you work with, and one person says, well, this is what I do. And then you have another person that says, well, I used to do that, but then I switched to this, or I do that and I do this, or whatever. And so as a brand new graduate, you're like, so what is it that I'm supposed to do? And so I think from an onboarding, from a successful teacher, satisfaction level, a retention level, that could bring a lot of happiness and relief to those new staff members who are like, okay, this is what I do. This is what we do. This is what our school does, and having that understanding. So I think that's excellent. And if we can get rid of some of those things and give teachers the opportunity to just teach and remove some of that time that they're spending, I think that's great too. The other perspective I would say would be from a parent perspective. And we have a lot of families who may have kids in different schools for whatever reason. Maybe one's in a specialized program, whether it's one of our specialized schools or maybe it's for special ed or whatever. And so for them to be able to say, I know that in my children's case, this is what we do, regardless of whether they're at school X or school Y, I think that's really beneficial and very predictable. So when they're talking to their friends or different people in their community, they aren't maybe alarmed by, well, we didn't do that, or wonder why I must not, my principal must not be doing what they're supposed to do, or whatever it might be. So I think from a consistency in messaging, even just from a community and a parent standpoint, that would be a huge win of people just knowing what to expect, regardless of where their student's at. So great information and a great way to explain it. And I don't want to say dumb it down, because it certainly wasn't that, but I think using analogies and helping people to kind of wrap their heads around that, when you're right, we're used to saying, well, we don't MTSS kids. We do that to ourselves, but this is a great opportunity to really look at the things we're using that are great, and some of the things that we are using that maybe are a little bit older and can be replaced by something better or combined with something as well. So.
Yeah, and a good point I was thinking about, I think it was a slide Dr. Nold showed with the phases of implementation. When you think about that, we do training this year, we do any number of things that happen in a given year, and then the next year new staff comes in, or they move buildings, like we've had this year just with opening new schools and the kind of transition that's a reality as part of that. How do you bring those new people up to speed? And then you have, teachers with many years of experience, veteran staff who have had the cumulative effect of training and experience, and then you bring a brand new teacher or a set of brand new teachers in, and we have to help them grow those tools as well. And so you may have a veteran staff one year, and the next year your staff changes significantly, and in that implementation phase, you'll swing around a little bit just by virtue of kind of what happens in a given year. So we have to constantly be thinking about what our systems are for how we onboard people and immediately start equipping them. And every year is different. You may have, a group of students with kind of a preponderance of needs in one year, and the next year that may look different, or you may be in a different classroom. So it's never a fixed target. It's always a fluid kind of a picture, but then we have to know how the system addresses that fluidity with each incoming group and each year that's different.
I When I watched the presentation, you said we're going to lessen what's on the plate. But right now, today, in the classroom, it's a Thanksgiving dinner. I mean, that plate's full. And that's one of the things I've heard from teachers when I visited with them, that they have a lot on their plate and they'd like to spend some more time, whatever. And I taught in high school, and, you know, it was a little bit different. I know the elementary teachers, in my opinion, they're preparing for a lot more things. So I hope it's true. I hope you're going to reduce what's on the plate and not increase it. And if it works, it'll be great. I mean, good things come out of the effort that we put into them. So hopefully it's going to work out.
Yeah, and you know, we hear that, and I think we've always dealt with that as a profession. And I don't know that we'll ever get rid of lots of things so the plate has empty spaces because of the nature of what we do. Teaching is complex, you know how that looks in the classroom, and some of it is what flows down from, you know, state, federal level requirements. Some of it is district processes. But if I look at that plate, I also want to be able to know the order of that plate. And, you know, as my friend Kendra used to say, I don't like my foods mixed on my plate. But we know why the plate is what we're being served and why we're being served. And sometimes making coherence of this is our Thanksgiving meal as opposed to, you know, this was just leftover slopped on the plate because it's all that we had, you know, just the reason and the why. And we hope that that MTSS umbrella helps to frame that up so that people see how does training and de-escalation fit with what we're maybe doing instructionally, and that they don't feel disconnected. And that's on us to do that, particularly with new staff or with people who are maybe coming into a different position even within our district. If you're moving into special education or EL, it's never going to be an empty plate, and complexities grow over time, and we're seeing that. And then we add the COVID lens on top of that, and some of the things that we think we're kind of seeing as a result of some of that. But we want it to be a plate that we're still wanting to eat from, even if it's with 2 forks sometimes.
Well, and also I think, especially a district of our size in South Dakota, people worry that the IPC is micromanaging or, you know, getting it, not letting them get. And what I always try to explain is, I don't believe IPC is trying to micromanage. What we're trying to do is show the best practices that we see within the district and share them with the entire district so that we can hopefully provide a consistent message to our families, our staff, and community, and do the best and be the best at what we're doing.
We're accountable for kids learning. I mean, that's all of our shared responsibility out to everybody in a classroom, and that's what we have to be diligent about doing, and doing it in the best ways we can over a long period of time. Many people doing the right thing over a long period of time gets good results.
Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, I'll move on to public input. I don't believe we had anybody sign up for that. So we will move on to adjournment and re-adjourn for Southeast Tech at 4. Do you have a motion to adjourn? You have a second? Motion second. We're adjourned. Thank you.